It was one of those high-stakes oversight hearings in Washington, the kind where the stakes aren't just policy, but reputation. The room was packed, reporters lined the back wall, congressional aides buzzed around with clipboards and phones, and the air held the unmistakable tension that comes when powerful people are about to clash in front of live cameras. Asterisk at the center of it all sat Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, known for his dry wit and plain-spoken approach to government. Kennedy wasn't one for posturing. He believed in asking sharp questions and cutting through what he called government fog. But not everyone appreciated that style, especially not Congressman Adam Schiff. Schiff, the Democrat from California, had built his brand on methodical presentations, long speeches, and carefully chosen words. But on this particular day, something was different. As the hearing unfolded, the topic turned to federal agencies' handling of surveillance protocols, a subject already under heavy scrutiny after several recent whistleblower leaks. Kennedy had been grilling witnesses with surgical precision, not letting vague answers slide, and pressing on inconsistencies in intelligence practices. Asterisk from Schiff's end of the table, the tone seemed too aggressive. Maybe he thought Kennedy was grandstanding. Maybe he felt the senator's pointed line of questioning was undermining the institution. Or maybe he just didn't like being challenged in a space where cameras were rolling. Either way, it reached a boiling point. Asterisk when the floor turned to Schiff for a comment. He leaned in, his voice steady but his tone unmistakably sharp. Senator Kennedy, he began, pausing for emphasis. Your line of questioning may play well on television, but it doesn't contribute to serious oversight. It undermines the process. Frankly, it borders on thuggish behavior. The word landed like a slap across the room. Some eyes widened, others darted around, unsure if they'd heard correctly. Schiff had just called a sitting U.S. senator a colleague, a thug, not in a backroom off the record exchange, not in a tweet, but right there, into the congressional record, in front of the nation. Asterisk, the room fell into an uneasy silence. The witnesses at the front of the room looked uncomfortable. Even some of Schiff's fellow Democrats blinked in disbelief. A few Republicans shook their heads but said nothing. The word hung in the air, bold and unapologetic. Asterisk, Adam Schiff didn't back down. He didn't apologize or try to soften it. He doubled down, adding, there's a way we conduct ourselves in this chamber, and there's a line that shouldn't be crossed. When you turn this committee into a spectacle, Senator, you're not defending the Constitution, you're dragging it through the mud. Asterisk, to be clear, Schiff wasn't accusing Kennedy of physical intimidation. His use of thug wasn't literal. But in the political world where words are wielded like weapons, the label carried heavy implications. It suggested that Kennedy wasn't just being combative, he was being unethical, even dangerous, in the way he exercised his authority. Asterisk, for someone like Kennedy, who values decorum despite his often unfiltered remarks, the insult wasn't just personal, it was political. Schiff had gone beyond challenging a viewpoint. He had attacked Kennedy's character in a venue where millions were watching, and he had done it with surgical precision, aiming to bruise more than just feelings. Asterisk, the strategy was clear. Schiff wanted to rattle Kennedy, maybe even goad him into losing his cool. In Washington, perception is everything. A few seconds of bad optics can erase years of credibility. Schiff likely believed that by painting Kennedy as a disruptive force, he could undermine the senator's influence on the hearing's outcome. Asterisk, but what he may not have counted on was how Kennedy would respond, not with fire but with ice. Not by shouting but by calmly turning the insult back on its source. Asterisk. The moment the word thug left Adam Schiff's mouth, the atmosphere in the hearing chamber shifted. Everyone in the room sensed it. Something had changed. An accusation like that, lobbed from one member of Congress to another in a formal hearing, wasn't just rare, it was jarring. And yet, Senator John Kennedy didn't so much as flinch. Asterisk, while aides whispered and journalists typed furiously in the back of the room. Kennedy simply placed his reading glasses on the table, pushed aside a stack of documents, and adjusted the microphone in front of him. His face didn't harden in anger, and his voice didn't rise in outrage. Instead, he spoke with that same deliberate cadence and southern calm that had become his trademark, a style that often made his sharpest words land even harder. Asterisk, Congressman Schiff, Kennedy began, his voice low and even. I'm from Louisiana. We talk straight. That's not thuggery, that's honesty. Asterisk, he paused just long enough for the words to settle. Schiff looked back at him, no longer smirking but trying to gauge where this was going. Everyone else leaned in, figuratively and literally. Kennedy continued, if it's honesty that offends you, then you may want to check whether your issue is with me or with the truth itself. Asterisk, he wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. The restraint in his tone was more effective than a heated argument. It was the kind of quiet that commanded attention and made the sting of each word more powerful. Schiff, known for his own sharp tongue, didn't interject. That, in itself, said a lot. Asterisk, Kennedy went on. Now, I've been in this chamber long enough to know that disagreement is part of the job. We come from different states, different parties, and different perspectives. That's democracy. But when disagreement turns into name-calling, well, Congressman, that says more about the speaker than the target. Asterisk, it wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a lesson. Kennedy was calling out Schiff without ever raising his voice or matching the hostility. He was doing what few in Washington managed to do well, keeping his composure while still making his point and making it sting. Asterisk, in contrast to Schiff's sharp accusation, Kennedy's words were measured, calculated, and pointed. He didn't accuse Schiff of misconduct. He didn't insult his intelligence. He simply held up a mirror and made Schiff look at the optics of his own behavior. Asterisk. And then came the part that truly shifted the tone of the entire hearing. Kennedy leaned slightly forward, eyes still fixed on Schiff. You say I make a spectacle, but Congressman, what's more of a spectacle, asking direct questions that the American people deserve answers to, or labeling a colleague a thug on live television because you didn't like the questions? Asterisk, there was no answer. Schiff didn't offer a rebuttal. The other members of the committee remained quiet, unsure whether jumping in would escalate things or make them look worse by association. Kennedy had diffused the accusation not by ignoring it, but by confronting it with quiet force. Asterisk, and perhaps the most surprising part was that Kennedy never tried to one-up the insult. He didn't try to turn Schiff into a villain. He didn't attack Schiff's record or resort to cheap shots. Instead, he framed the moment as an opportunity to expose the kind of political theater that too often overshadows real oversight. Asterisk, he ended his remarks by simply saying, I'm here to do a job. That job is asking questions that a lot of people out there, the folks who sent me here, want answers to. You may not like my tone, Congressman, but I'll take candor over rehearsed speeches any day of the week. Asterisk, it was a reminder that sometimes silence is louder than noise. And sometimes the calmest response leaves the deepest impression. Schiff had tried to provoke. Kennedy had chosen precision. The result, Schiff's accusation fell flat, while Kennedy's reply echoed far beyond the walls of the hearing room. Asterisk. As Senator John Kennedy sat calmly in the hearing room, the atmosphere still thick from Adam Schiff's earlier accusation, it became increasingly clear that Kennedy wasn't going to let the comment slide without deeper examination. Schiff had called him a thug, a label heavy with implication. But instead of brushing it off or firing back with insult for insult, Kennedy did something more effective. He exposed the double standard behind the accusation. Asterisk, in Washington, words carry weight, and Kennedy knew that. That's why, when it was his turn to speak again, he chose not to focus solely on the offense itself, but on the mindset behind it. His voice remained calm and steady, but his message was sharp. Asterisk, Congressman Schiff, Kennedy began. You've built your entire public profile on civility and process, long speeches, measured tones, and the appearance of fairness. But that doesn't mean what you say is always fair. There's a difference between being polite and being principled. Asterisk, he adjusted his chair slightly and looked directly across the chamber. You say I'm a thug because I ask hard questions. Questions your side doesn't want to answer. That's not thuggery, Congressman. That's oversight. That's my job. Asterisk, the room remained quiet, and Schiff, sitting upright but not responding, seemed more guarded than he had earlier. Kennedy continued, this time addressing the broader implications of what Schiff's comment represented. Asterisk, let's be honest here, he said. When someone on your side of the aisle asks tough questions, it's called accountability. When someone on mine does the same thing, it's suddenly an attack on democracy. That kind of double standard isn't just frustrating, it's dangerous. Asterisk, with that, Kennedy leaned slightly forward, and his voice dropped just a touch, not in volume but in tone. If we can't question the agencies we fund, if we can't press for answers when things don't add up, then we're not doing the people's work, we're just putting on a show. Asterisk, he pointed out that Schiff, for years, had led investigations, held press conferences, and authored reports that heavily scrutinized political figures, many of them on the opposing side. And I never called you a thug for doing your job, Kennedy noted. I disagreed with you. I challenged your conclusions. But I never once attacked your character because I believed, perhaps naively, that we could disagree without descending into name-calling. Asterisk, there was a brief moment when Kennedy paused, letting the weight of that contrast hang in the air. The difference between challenging ideas and attacking individuals had become the heart of his argument. Schiff's comment, Kennedy implied, wasn't just inappropriate, it was revealing. It showed a discomfort with dissent, especially when that dissent came from someone outside the preferred narrative. Asterisk, I represent people who don't have lobbyists walking these halls, Kennedy said. They don't speak in polished sound. They don't have publicists or PACs. They ask plain questions and expect plain answers. That's the voice I bring into this room. If that offends you, Congressman, then maybe it's the people you have a problem with, not me. Asterisk, it was a masterful shift. Kennedy took Schiff's accusation and flipped it not just to defend himself, but to highlight what he saw as the growing hypocrisy in how oversight was being portrayed. When Schiff or his allies questioned power, it was noble. When Kennedy did it, it was thuggish. That double standard, Kennedy made clear, was not going to go unchallenged. Asterisk, his words didn't rely on theatrics or dramatic gestures. They relied on facts, consistency, and a refusal to be boxed into someone else's narrative. Kennedy didn't just rebut the insult, he reframed the entire exchange. Schiff had tried to paint him as aggressive and unruly, but by calmly pointing out the inconsistency in Schiff's own record and demeanor, Kennedy left many in the room, and watching from afar, questioning who had really crossed the line. And Schiff, once so quick with his criticism, sat silent. The hearing had already made waves inside the chamber, but it was what happened afterward that truly amplified the moment. When Senator John Kennedy responded to Congressman Adam Schiff's accusation with calm, measured resolve, few could have predicted how quickly the public would seize on it. Within minutes of the exchange, news outlets had clipped the moment and pushed it out to social media platforms. Kennedy's composed but cutting reply began to circulate, and so did the stunned expression on Schiff's face. Kennedy didn't just defend himself, he struck at the deeper problem, the idea that questioning official narratives was somehow unacceptable if it didn't come from the right voices. That message resonated not just with conservatives, but with people across the political spectrum who had grown weary of performative politics and selective outrage. While Schiff had hoped to corner Kennedy as a political antagonist, Kennedy had calmly reframed himself as a public servant doing exactly what the Constitution intended. The public reaction was immediate. Social media lit up with praise for Kennedy's response. Hashtags like #KennedyClapback, #DoubleStandards, and #ThugRemark began trending on X, formerly Twitter. Clips of the exchange were replayed across cable news and online platforms, and pundits on both the left and the right weighed in. Some of Schiff's usual allies hesitated to defend the thug comment, noting that even for Washington, the language was unusually personal and unnecessarily inflammatory. Kennedy's response stood out precisely because of what it wasn't. It wasn't theatrical, it wasn't angry, it wasn't a tirade. It was clear, grounded, and confident, the kind of rebuttal that didn't rely on volume to carry weight. One political analyst described it as the most composed assault of a personal attack we've seen in a congressional hearing in years. Another noted that Schiff, often the aggressor in hearings, looked visibly rattled by how little Kennedy had to do to shift the power dynamic. Meanwhile, Schiff faced uncomfortable questions from reporters as he left the hearing. One journalist asked him directly, "Do you regret using the word thug in a formal hearing?" Schiff avoided the question, offering only a vague response about tensions running high and the need for civility on all sides. But the contrast was already clear. Kennedy had answered Schiff's accusation on the record, in real time, with grace. Schiff now seemed to be walking his own words back. Even editorial boards not usually inclined to praise Kennedy took notice. One moderate outlet remarked that Schiff's choice of language risked undermining the credibility of the oversight process by turning it into a personal battleground. Another observed that Kennedy had managed to neutralize the insult not by returning fire, but by standing on principle. The response outside Washington was even more telling. Kennedy's constituents, many of whom value straight talk and resilience over rhetoric, flooded his office with supportive calls and emails. Several letters published in local Louisiana newspapers praised Kennedy for staying true to his roots and not letting DC games shake him. Town hall discussions and talk radio shows in multiple states cited the exchange as an example of how elected officials should handle political attacks, not with outrage, but with clarity and composure. What Schiff may have intended as a strategic hit ended up boosting Kennedy's public image. Kennedy's refusal to stoop to the level of insult only enhanced his reputation as someone who didn't just speak plainly, but who could also navigate political conflict without losing control. And in the world of modern politics, where image and tone can matter just as much as policy, that made a significant difference. In the days following the hearing, Kennedy was invited on several news programs. He didn't gloat. He didn't even dwell on the insult. Instead, he reiterated what he said in the chamber, that public servants have a duty to ask tough questions and that disagreement is not disorder. The quiet dignity of that approach seemed to win over even some skeptical viewers. Meanwhile, Schiff found himself on the defensive, not because of the substance of the hearing, but because of the tone he had set. His attempt to frame Kennedy as a disruptive force had backfired. The public wasn't buying it, not after watching a man calmly respond to a pointed insult with nothing but truth, logic, and restraint. As the dust settled from the high-profile hearing, one thing became unmistakably clear. Adam Schiff's attempt to diminish Senator John Kennedy with a single word had the opposite effect. In a political environment where outrage often overshadows principle, Kennedy's steady and dignified response stood as a rare example of how to navigate personal attacks without sacrificing credibility. While Schiff may have expected to put Kennedy on the defensive, it was Kennedy's calm defiance and unwavering focus that turned the tables in front of the nation. Kennedy didn't just push back against the insult, he elevated the moment. Rather than retaliate with anger or get caught up in personal grievance, he used Schiff's words to draw attention to the larger issue, a troubling pattern in politics, where dissent is vilified when it doesn't align with mainstream narratives. By calmly dismantling the logic behind Schiff's accusation, Kennedy reminded the public that oversight is not only a right but a responsibility, one that should not be dismissed with name-calling or political theater. Asterisk. What made the moment even more powerful was Kennedy's refusal to match insult with insult. He didn't stoop to Schiff's level, and he didn't try to score cheap political points. Instead, he turned a personal slight into a broader statement on the health of American discourse. His message was simple: respect differences, defend truth, and never apologize for asking the hard questions. Asterisk. The reaction from across the country only amplified that message. Americans, regardless of political party, saw something refreshing in Kennedy's response, not because it was flashy, but because it wasn't. In a sea of shouting matches and viral meltdowns, here was a public servant who didn't take the bait. His strength was in his restraint, and that restraint spoke volumes. Asterisk. For Adam Schiff, the moment served as a cautionary tale. In politics, words are tools and sometimes weapons, but when misused, they can boomerang quickly, revealing more about the speaker than their target. Schiff's thug remark may have been meant to discredit Kennedy, but instead it cast a shadow over Schiff's own credibility. Many who once admired his composure and intellect were left wondering why such an experienced lawmaker would resort to such a personal attack, and why he underestimated Kennedy's ability to turn the moment around. Asterisk. In the end, the exchange wasn't just about two men with opposing views. It was a snapshot of the larger tension in Washington, between decorum and disruption, between principle and partisanship. And in that moment, Senator John Kennedy stood out, not for how loudly he spoke, but for how clearly he refused to be silenced. Asterisk. It was a reminder that in American politics, character still counts, and sometimes the strongest response is the one that simply tells the truth without